Hi, everybody. My name is Nan Zhou, a senior scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm delighted to be invited to give a talk at this conference today. I'm regretful that I won't be there in person and with you, and hopefully I can join you in the future. So I will be talking about the low carbon technologies for a carbon neutrality and future pathways, and we can have a little bit introduction for China Energy Group that I'm in within the Berkeley lab. It's funded in 1988, so it has been around for 33 years. And we've been developing very impactful and science-based solutions on clean energy and technologies, collaborating with China and throughout all these 3 decades. And the group has roughly 12 staff members, and it used to host many visiting researchers from China until the COVID hit. It worked with many government institutions, academia, and private companies in China and in the world, and to help understand energy dynamics in China, but also introducing best practices and technologies, policies, and to China. We have published and a lot of energy related data and the annual China Energy Outlook that has provided historical trends, targets, programs, and the future scenarios. So first of all, and I want to quickly introduce a study we recently just completed to look at the various carbon neutrality pathways from different institutions in China. You already know that Chinese President Xi Jinping announced China will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. What it really means is that CO2 emission will need to get down to 0 by 2050. And so there's a list of studies published before this target even was announced to evaluate whether China can actually achieve that goal, and then what are the pathways and it will need to take on to achieve that. And so here you will see that we reviewed 8 studies in China and also outside of China. And there are 10 scenarios we looked at. And you will see on the table here, there's 1.5 degrees C scenario, which basically shows the carbon emission needs to get down to 0 by 2050. And so a number of studies look at that. And also 2 degrees C compatible scenario basically is keep the temperature rise from climate change to under 2 degrees C. And so that's slightly less aggressive than the 1.5 degrees C, which is to maintain the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees C. So we look at a number of scenarios and to assess the 2 degrees C. And then there was a number of other scenarios, including our own, the Berkeley Labs CEO scenario, and a few other studies. So these studies we looked, and they all employ decarbonization strategies, including efficiency, including electrification, and power sector decarbonization, and alternative clean fuels, and even sequestration of carbon. And also they look at the policy recommendations for all the sectors. So to summarize from these studies, what we found is that in all of those, the final energy consumption by 2050 will likely to peak by 2025, which is only 4 years from now, or 3 years. And for the global temperature rise to be below 1.5 degrees C. And so, there's range for the reduction of the final energy from today's level. And so that all the scenario we looked at shows that it will need to stay relatively flat from today's level, 2020 level. And in some scenario, it needs to be 30% below today's level. As you all know, China is still developing, and also the economy will continue to be developed further, and the people will have better life, and comfort level will rise with those. And it's actually quite challenging to maintain the current energy consumption level. If we look at the CO2 emissions, and we found that the 1.5 degrees C scenario and will require the CO2 emissions to peak today, 2020, already passed. And we don't know if that happened or not. The 2 degrees C scenario finds that the CO2 emissions to peak before 2030. And with steep drop, and after 2030, you can see the green range, and to 2040, that's a cliff and needs to be on. And the end point of 2050, and here, right here, and there's a large range, and showing here, it will be heavily relied on negative emission technologies. So that means CCS, or carbon removal, if we cannot get to zero with today's commercially available technologies in all the sectors, in buildings, industry, and transport. So the key decarbonization strategies in all the studies include energy efficiency and demand reduction. The efficiency improvement will need to continue to increase, but the potential will be different in different sectors. So for buildings, it needs to improve by 50 to 60%. And for industries, it depends on which sector, and it will need to be improved roughly around 20% for cement, steel, and the chemical sector. And also, it needs to have significant reduction in energy demand through the structure change in industry, through the increased utilization of circularity and efficiency, and even including the change of urban planning and the lifestyles. And of course, needs to integrate innovative technologies in all the sectors. Some key pillars for reducing the CO2 emissions also relies on electrification of end-use sector and power sector decarbonization. What it means is that in all the sectors, for example, in transport, we'll be using all electric vehicles, electric trucks, and or for buildings, and we'll have electric heating, and also even cooking and water heating, and needs to be electrified. At the same time, and the electricity needs to come from renewable sources and other non-fossil fuels. Coal will mostly be phased out, and instead we'll have solar and the wind and the hydro and the biomass and all these renewable and technologies. So we look at these scenarios shows in buildings, and it has the biggest electrification potential. And it can get to 77 or 80% by 2050. For transportation sector, today the electrification is still very low, as we all still mostly driving internal combustion engine cars. But in the future, to achieve the carbon neutrality, and it needs to get to 33 to even 57% of the electrification rate. In industry sector, and to achieve this 1.5 degree scenario, and we found, and many of the studies show that it needs to be 48 to 70% electrified in industry sector. And I will show you that's going to be a very challenging pathway. And also the 1.5 degree C compatible pathways, and identify the electricity generation needs to come from 90% non-fossil fuels by 2050, as I mentioned earlier. the solar and the wind and will be most important. It needs to increase the share from 9% today to 34, even 70% by 2050. And nuclear for China will continue to play some roles, there will be very limited role for coal and natural gas, as I mentioned earlier. And even for the parts that's remaining, it's a black here, it will need to be equipped with CCS by 2050. As you can see here, the green ones are renewables. All the studies show there will be significant and the increase of the share from today's level. The future strategies included in these studies and also included alternative fuels such as biofuel, hydrogen, and CCUS. Although the deployment of these technologies face some limitation constraints in such as resource availability for biofuel or biomass. And there's also cost and the timeline of delivery for hydrogen production and also electrification and relied on alternative low carbon fuels. And also all the studies find it requires sequestration of CO2 emissions and from an atmosphere. And some of the study included even 1 gigaton of CO2 per year of the sequestration and or net carbon sink. This is a very large and quantity of the CO2 that needs to be sequestered and stored from today's level, because even today we only have a number of the pilot and projects. So, and after we look at these different studies, we also concluded there's a lot of system solutions need to be put in place. And for example, in industry, and emission needs to be reduced by 50%. And the strategies are included in this table, and such as lightweight, low carbon cement, low carbon concrete, and also high quality products to reduce the demand. There's also potential for additional energy efficiency, smart energy management, waste heat recovery, and to improve the efficiency of the plants. And also include the fuel switching and, for example, using solar thermal, geothermal, biomass for feedstock, even hydrogen and CCUS for cement and steel and the chemical industry. And then lastly, and the electrification will be key for many of these sectors. And so that includes the high efficiency electric heating furnaces and also electrifying industry heat on-site and renewables and also even electrolysis for iron making. However, this industry heat is a very difficult and process to electrify. So here, this slide and shows some of this the technologies commercialized and emerging and to electrify. In these 3 key sectors, chemical, cement, iron, steel, and you can see some are requirement for low heat, some are medium, and some are high heat. And these high heat and processes are very hard to electrify. And you can see in the table down below, it mostly requires new emerging technologies such as plasma melting, electrolytic reduction, and even electrical induction and hydrogen. The lower heat below 400 degrees C, some of the technologies are available today, such as heat pumps, induction heating, and also radio frequency heating. And also there are some emerging, such as microwave heating, UV heating. And but the many of the areas, and it requires additional and research development and the significant acceleration of technology to market process. In building sectors, and the buildings are getting much more complex and the comparison in the past. In the past, we live in the building, we get electricity from the grid or use the gas for cooking or for heating. But today's buildings. It can get the electricity from the rooftop PV, and also it could be installed with storage battery. It could have electric vehicles charged in the buildings, and also could be used as storage. And it can communicate with the grid through demand response. There's smart meters, there's thermostat, and there's automation, control, and there's also distributed generation. All of these made the buildings very complex. So future buildings need to be net zero emission and grid responsive and smart. There's also areas that we can do better in terms of reducing this emission, and that's embodied in the building materials. For example, and there will be an envelope, and that's made through the low carbon cement or reduced cement or concrete needs. And there could be materials that use mass timber and to replace concrete and cement, because those are very high carbon emitting. And also today we have 3D printing and technologies, and we can print houses or low-rise buildings and without wasting a lot of building materials. In the transportation sector, as mentioned earlier, electrifying and the freight will be the key and challenging and hard to abate sector. But if we want to get to carbon neutrality, and we'll need to employ and quite a bit of share of the electric trucks, and Tesla and a number of other companies are also developing these new models that will be in market and very soon. And with the battery technology getting cheaper and lighter and smaller, and also with more improved visibility for long distance travel, and we will be able to have more electric and trucks carrying goods and within a reasonable mile range, and then also it could be cost effective. So with that, and I will conclude my talk today, and thank you very much. If you have questions, and feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.